Okay, if folks want to find, as we're situating here, finding a seat, we are live streaming this evening. Welcome, good evening. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and also a member, I was co-chair of the UF Presidential Task Force on African American and Native American History at the University of Florida. On behalf of the Proctor program, and actually on behalf of Judy Russell, who just called, Judy wanted to be here. She's, of course, the dean of our libraries, and she just finished up with a program at OCAMIC, and so she's not going to be able to make it for the beginning, and she said, you know, go ahead and start the program. But I do want at the outset to really thank Judy from the bottom of my heart, because the libraries are hosting this event. My first introduction to the University of Florida was through the libraries. I was an anonymous graduate student at Duke University. I came down here working on my dissertation. I don't know even what topic I was hoping to work on, but I met people like Carl Van Ness, Jim Cusick, Joel Buchanan, Bruce, I'm blanking his last name, great, Chapel, yeah, incredible. So I always feel at home when I'm here. And I also want you to, we have programs, and if you want to look through the program, on the back is a list of some of our co-sponsors, and I just want to thank our co-sponsors for supporting the program, including the libraries, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, the Department of History, African American Studies, and many others. This is part of a year-long series, public program series that the Proctor program is sponsoring called Challenging Racism at UF. And on your program, you'll see that we are supported by an Advancing Racial Justice grant from the University of Florida, and that makes this program and others like it possible, so we're very grateful. Tonight's program is really exciting. There's going to be a lot of information. It'll be interesting to see what we come up with in terms of sharing with you this 2 years labor of love. I think when the task force began, we didn't realize it would take 2 years, did we? Or we just, I thought it would be like 3 months or something, right? But it did take 2 full years. And we also, I want to share with you that we do have print copies. Everyone should be able to get tonight a print copy of the report. I think I see most people have that in front of them. And we'll talk about accessibility as well. Before I turn the mic over, I do want to say that our next public program, which here at Smathers, will be a very special book signing. Dan Berger has just completed a book called State on Freedom, and this profiles the incredible work of Michael Simmons and our own beloved Dr. Zohara Simmons in the Black freedom struggle. That's going to be a book signing where Dan and Zohara are going to talk about the book. It's not to be missed, and that's going to be 5 p.m. also February 23rd here in Library East, room 100. So we're going to begin the program tonight, and I'll just run through the organization of this. The task force panelists are going to begin with Carl on the end, giving just kind of brief introductions of ourselves, like who we are, kind of where we're from, and we'll pass the mic down. And then we have a great group of student questioners who will also introduce themselves, who are going to ask us a series of questions about the task force, including, you know, what was your personal academic journey into being a member of this presidential task force? What is a presidential task force? That's a good question to begin with. Not everyone knows what that is, right? And then kind of walk us through the process, the research, the collaboration, the dialogue, the debate, and what we came up with, this 110-some page report that you have in front of you. So the students will ask us rounds of questions, then we'll open it up for audience Q&A for hopefully about 15 minutes or so. We'll do final reflections, and then again we'll get together and walk across the street to the wonderful UF Institute of Black Culture for a reception with food and refreshments, and just kind of hang out and talking. So without further delay, let me turn over to my dear colleague, Carl, and then we'll just go on down the line to introduce ourselves.
Good evening. I'm Carl Van Ness. I am University Librarian Emeritus, retired in July. I'm also University Historian Emeritus, and I'll just leave it at that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adreanne Martinez. I am currently a second-year student at the University of Florida Levin College of Law.
Good evening, David Canton, Director of the African American Studies Program at UF and Associate Professor of History.
Hi, Ken Sassaman, Professor of Anthropology and an archaeologist of the ancient American Southeast.
Hi, how's everyone? I'm Hazel Levy. I'm instructor of genetics in the biology department, and I'm the associate director for UF's Center for Pre-Collegiate Education and Training. I'm also a graduate student in the College of Education, studying higher ed policy and administration, and I do a couple other things too.
Hello, my name is Jon Sensbach. I'm a professor of history and chair of the Department of History.
Paul Ortiz, Professor of History and Director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program.
Where does this thing go now? Back down? Yeah. Okay.
Test, 1, 2. Okay. First, thank you guys for being out here tonight. We really appreciate it, all your hard work on this report, and really looking forward to talking about it with you guys. So our first question is, like Dr. Ortiz mentioned, what was your journey in getting onto this task force? Your both your personal and academic journey, and how has it led you to become a part of this task force?
Are we going in line, Paul?
Yeah, why don't we keep doing that?
Okay, well, that's a long story for me. I've worked in the Department of Special and Area Studies Collections here in the library for 38 years, serving in the university archives originally, and then a variety of positions, including political historian, political papers archivist, I was appointed university historian by President Machen, so I have a long association with the university's history. I've studied the university's history for many, many years, and when President Fox asked me to be a member of the committee, I said, yes, absolutely, I will do that. So that is how I came to be part of the task force.
So I am a double Gator. I'm currently at UF Law, but I graduated from UF with degrees in history and poli-sci in spring of 2020. And spring 2020, I was writing my senior history thesis. I was really interested in learning about all these institutions across the United States that were reconciling with their history of slavery. So Harvard, Georgetown, Clemson, a lot of leading institutions are in this movement. And so I was researching the University of Florida with that, and specifically my thesis dealt with how students are catalysts for institutional change. Students are the ones that are forcing administrators to reconcile with their histories of slavery, convict leasing, and prison labor. So I was looking into Harvard, Georgetown, Clemson, and the University of Florida. And while researching the University of Florida, I came across a 2019 history undergraduate report, which Dr. Sensbach will talk about a little bit more later. But in that report, it was written by history students. And I remember being so impressed by this research because it had UF's substantial connections to slavery in it. But while I was impressed by it, I was disappointed to learn that its publication in 2019 didn't necessarily result in administrative action. Like, that report's been out for over a year, and there wasn't anything on the administrative level saying, like, acknowledging it. So with that in mind, I reached out to the 2019 report authors, and we drafted a student government resolution in spring of 2020. And that resolution requested UF administrators to assemble a working group on indigenous expropriation and slavery. Me and the other co-drafters of that resolution, we got 40 sponsors that included professors and departments and centers, and it passed unanimously in the Student Senate on June 2nd of 2020. And then June 18th is when President Fox announced that he would create a task force. So that was kind of how I got involved in the movement. And then later that year, I was appointed to serve on that task force. So it's testament to student activism. So all of you students out there, yeah. But yeah.
I received a call from President Fox. I got here during August 2020, COVID. He gave me a call. I said, sure, I'll serve. At that time, Black Thursday, O'Connell Center, all this didn't have any meaning to me, so I was kind of apprehensive because I really had no background in history of UF, but definitely serving on this task force and being director of the African American Studies program, this helped set context for me as I build the department, knowing this history is important. But initially I was a little nervous because, like I said before, Black Thursday, O'Connell, Hawkins, I never heard him before in my life. So I came here starting from ground zero, but it was a worthwhile adventure.
Well, when President Fox called me, I did my best to convince him I wasn't the best person for the job, because I'm an archaeologist of the ancient past and not much of a student of the recent past. But I did tell him that I thought that the history of Native American relations at the University of Florida really turns on land dispossession, and that process is ongoing. It's not just an historical benchmark of colonial times, but we still don't do justice in the stewardship of the land that's been expropriated from Native people. So I also, when I joined the committee, I realized that I certainly didn't have enough knowledge to treat this history authoritatively, and also I'm not indigenous. And first thing I had to overcome, I think, was just the idea that this be tacked on to a project that ostensibly was precipitated by the murder of George Floyd, and we have the reason, of course, to delve into that, and many institutions did. But certainly I learned with this committee, this great committee, that the Native American past, the colonial past, right on up through the 20th century, is intertwined pretty tightly with the African American experience, particularly with regard to slavery. But I took my committee, I created a subcommittee, and I took it in this different direction that perhaps we'll talk about a little bit later. And I do want to acknowledge these other folks that helped out. I got permission from our chair and co-chair to create a subcommittee. So I solicited help from members of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. That would be Robin Wright in religion, Rich Conley in political science. And then I asked folks at the Florida Museum of Natural History that I'm familiar with. They were working on Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act responsibilities that the university had. Neil Wallace and Donna Rule. And then Janessa Mahar, who is working with Paul on the Doris Duke project to digitize oral histories of Native people. She joined us from the Smathers library system. We still didn't have indigenous people, so I look around the university for indigenous scholars. We have very few. We have more now than we did a couple of years ago, perhaps, but we're still woefully underrepresented in that respect. But we did have two students, Natalia Turkle, an undergraduate, and Brendan David John, a graduate student in engineering, who's now a professor, I think, at Virginia Tech, somewhere up north, so he's done very well for himself. They're both of Native American identity and affiliation. So that's how I came to be a member of this. I learned a lot. I really appreciate the expertise and professionalism of my colleagues here.
So it was a stretch for me. I felt like reserved as well. I come from a biophysics background and genetics and virology and medical sciences. So what is a person like that doing on a history task force, right? But when I got hired as faculty to the College of Medicine and I looked around, I asked some questions. So my interest in studying race in higher education came very naturally through my career path. When I looked around and didn't see folks, diversity in any sense, let alone any other black folks. And so I asked a simple question, have there been others? And what was it like for black researchers, particularly I asked about black women in the College of Medicine and the history, and So by asking those questions, I learned that there's a lot of resistance to sharing those types of data. There's a lot of concern when you ask about your own position in current history, and if you are a geneticist or a biophysicist and you're asking questions about history, people want you to do your real job, right? And so I met Antonio Farias. He was our first chief diversity officer, and I used to whine and whine and whine to him about my challenges with getting data and with just people caring. And I think that he must have put my name in Dr. Fox's mind to invite on the task force for those reasons. So.
I guess my participation in this project began several years ago when I was teaching a course on slavery, and as Adreanne mentioned, universities and colleges across the country have been asking, these questions for several years now. To what extent has our institution been involved, was involved in slavery? And an alarming number of them, came to the conclusion that they had deep financial investments in slavery in the 18th and 19th century, and that their wealth derived from enslaved labor. In the course of the class that I was teaching, somebody asked the question, well, has anybody ever done any research on UF in that regard? And I wasn't aware of any at that point. And so I was able to cull 4 very talented students from that class to do an independent study the next semester to investigate that very question. And those students, Ahmad Brown, Gabriella Paul, Javier Escotier Garcia, and Morgan Peltier ended up writing a research report on that very topic. And that report was ultimately published, called Slavery in the University of Florida, African Americans, Seminoles, and the Origins of Higher Education in Florida. And by the way, I have a digital copy of that. If you give me your name afterwards, I'd be happy to send you a copy. But very, very briefly, what they found was that the forerunner of the University of Florida, which was founded in 1905, was called the East Florida Seminary. It was a very small school in Ocala, Florida, just 40 miles south of here. And the origins of that institution were, as Ken said, in native land dispossession. After the Second Seminole War, the Seminole people were driven off the land, and it was appropriated by incoming settlers and the U.S. government. That land was sold and given as grants to incoming settlers, and the money from those sales went into an educational trust fund called the Seminary Land Fund, and that fund went to pay for the origins of the East Florida Seminary. And many of the settlers who bought that land came to Florida, bringing enslaved laborers from South Carolina and Georgia and elsewhere, and they established a cotton plantation economy here in this part of Florida. And many of those families sent their children to this school, the East Florida Seminary. And so therefore, these students were able to conclude that there's a tight connection between native land dispossession, the origins of the slave economy here in Florida, and the origins of the University of Florida. And so between 1853 and 1865, when that seminary existed in Ocala, it was tightly embedded in the slave economy, and therefore the students rightly concluded that the origins of this institution, like so many others across the country, and particularly in the South, is deeply embedded in the institution of slavery and racism. And that report served as a kind of prequel to this report here, the report of the Presidential Task Force, because it kind of set the stage for research that the committee did after 1865 all the way up to the present.
Y'all got calls from Kent Fox. I just got a call from Wynn Phillips. I worked with Wynn on a number of different projects, including when Ken Fox first arrived, we served together on the UF Goals and Vision Task Force. And I've always been a movement historian. My pathway into academia is a bit non-traditional in that I'm, like many of you here, I'm actually a first-generation college student. And I initially learned the craft of being a movement historian long before I went to grad school. And the responsibility of that is you have to step up, you have to do the workshops, you have to do the extra research. It means things like when the Black Lives Matter movement really restarted or regenerated and just was such an incredible movement in the spring of 2020, I got a call late one evening from Evelyn Fox, the president of the Alachua County NAACP, and she said, "Paul, you're now the official historian for the Alachua County NAACP." I said, okay. But see, that's the life of a movement historian. I'm excited to hear from Zahara Simmons in February because she's been doing it much longer than I have. But that first experience in being on the Alachua School District Task Force, where we changed the name of an elementary school that had been named after a Confederate general for 80 years, transitioning it to Carolyn Beatrice Parker, was a very important experience for me because in some ways it overlapped the experience on this task force. What we did was very unpopular in many, many parts of our county. Some of us received threatening phone calls. A number of different of us were threatened that if you name the school after an African-American woman, there will be repercussions that you will have to face for that. But to be able to serve with people like Patricia Hilliard-Nunn on that task force, and then to kind of transition to this task force, for me has been just an incredibly inspiring process. And really, it's our students who really demanded change. When the Black Lives Matter movement really resurged in the spring of 2020, it was the students in this campus and high school students and middle school students who really demanded a change. And so I think that's part of the energy that led President Fox to issue his announcement, which I consider to be one of the most important historical events in the history of this university. When he came out and made the announcement that created this task force, it didn't have everything we may have been looking for, but it was a critical turning point for this university, especially in getting us to look in the mirror.
Thank you for your responses. I'm Sophia, I'm a third year. And our second question is, what was it like, the experience of working on this task force, especially with multiple people doing outreach and with so much information to contain in such a small space? And generally, what did your meetings look like?
Well, of course, this all coincided with COVID. So for me, it was, I think, probably the first committee I was on during COVID. So it was all via Zoom. I think I've met everybody on the committee. Absolutely sure. Yes, I have. So there was that. It was really an interesting process, and I credit Wynn Phillips a lot, our other co-chair, for his organizational discipline in getting us to do the work. He was a very firm taskmaster. He set deadlines and told us, we had to get this done. And Wynn was always saying he was not an historian, and he deferred to everybody else on the committee who was an historian in terms of some of the questions that we were asking. But it was a very interesting process. We divided up into teams. Each team took a different period in our history. The one I was on dealt with the period between 1905 and 1948, which is an incredibly interesting time in our history. It's one of the darkest times in American history. It includes not only the tremendous oppression that was occurring in the South in terms of massacres such as Rosewood, Ocoee, East St. Louis, Tulsa, Chicago, but also just a dark time politically. I've just finished reading Adam Hochschild's American Midnight, dealing with the period from 1917 and beginning America's entry into World War I and extending into the 1920s. And it's just incredible what was going on in the country at that time. So, we were dealing with some of the same historical materials, things that were going on at the University of Florida at that time. So, again, it was a wonderful experience for me. I learned a lot. I would say that I'd point out Hazel's contribution in her study of eugenics at the University of Florida, how eugenics was used, how it was used in the classroom, and in terms of research, publication. It was an aspect that I had never really considered. I knew it existed, I knew we were doing it, but I never really thought, this would, to do an in-depth study of that. So I thought that was one of the more interesting aspects of what we came out with.
Adding on to Carl's point, we probably met around maybe once a month, I would say. It was all on Zoom, though. So, this is the first time most of us are meeting each other on this task force. So it's really nice for us to come together and do this. I will say, for me, that was my first experience ever really working with, administration. So it took me a while to figure out how to walk the line between being a student activist and getting things done, and then also being an agent of the university where you have to go through all these bureaucratic types of hoops. So it was a really interesting experience in that sense. And along with your question about how we were able to fit everything we wanted to into this 100-page report. This report was never meant to be an end-all type of thing. We're hoping that this report drops the breadcrumbs for future researchers to do and for all future generations to come. So we're hoping that whatever comes out of this report, it inspires the next generation of activists and so on.
Kind of stole my thunder. I think we all understood the assignment, that this isn't the end-all, be-all history. It's a starting point, a foundation for future studies. I think we all came in with that approach. So we knew we had limited time, but we knew that we'll put enough information out there for further studies and give you just a foundation on where these groups lie to the UF from the past to the present. I think we overall did a good job. It was 100 pages, good resources there, good sources. So I think it's a good start. So for those that might say, well, it should be longer, we could do more, you missed something, but we knew going into that we're not going to cover everything. It's just not going to happen. But nevertheless, it's a great foundation.
I was frustrated from the start for two reasons. And by the way, it ameliorated over time. But one, wasn't clear that we were charged with producing a product. So I was the gadfly reminding the committee constantly that we're going to write a report, because at first there was some suggestion we were going to do a timeline, and it was just going to be objective and speak for itself. And I think any historian would scoff at the idea that history is simply a chronicle of events. Right? There's an interpretation that goes with that. So the second frustration was that we were asked not to be direct about recommendations for improving futures. And that was frustrating. But our subcommittee has a long list of recommendations should anybody care to see them.
So it was great to work with these folks. I learned a lot about what is history, how to do it, and all of that. But there was a lot of politicking, pushing back and saying, well, we're not here to just do that assignment. We're here to investigate what we think is important, right? And so I agree that this report should serve as a foundation, but I also think that it's not the report we would have written with the resources that I think should have been allocated to it. None of us were this wasn't funded, this was on top of the work we were already doing. It was in addition, right? And so I think this work should be deeply critiqued, honestly, and then the foundation should come in a more supported way, I think, and maybe we'll get to that. But I learned a lot, and because I was doing this work on top of what I had already done, I just kind of tried to do what I knew. And so at the time I was a graduate student, so I got to go to the archives and do a lot of research. So sort of, for me, the experience involved becoming a historical scholar in a way that I certainly hadn't before, digging into old documents. And the task was to look at UF and with African Americans and Native American history, but the period that we were working on was such deep segregation that I wanted to look at whiteness at the time. And so that's where the eugenics kind of idea came about. Well, that was the race that was present on campus. That was what was going on. I wanted to look at how whiteness scholarship was generated at the time, which is what I think was going on. So I just want to add that we were kind of balancing, like, how do we do this versus what do we want to do, and that this document would probably be a lot different if we were doing movement history as opposed to doing a president of a university's request with a non-historical administrator kind of at the helm. It would have been different, right?
Well, the experience is, as was pointed out earlier, this was, we divided into teams, and so this was very much a collaborative effort among the different teams. And so I was fortunate to work with Adreanne, as she mentioned earlier, and with Gabriella Paul, and together we got the task of looking at UF's prehistory from 1865, right after the Civil War, to 1905, the official founding of the University of Florida. So that 40-year period. Very, very briefly, what we learned was that the East Florida Seminary, after the Civil War, moved from Ocala to Gainesville in 1866 and operated until 1905, when it closed and was merged into the University of Florida. The other institution with which it merged was called the Florida Agricultural College in Lake City, and that was sort of the basic land grant institution that, again, proved a forerunner institution for UF. So our task was to try to learn how did these two white institutions function in a state that was going through these tumultuous changes after the Civil War into Reconstruction, African-American demands for equality, political participation, suffrage, all those kinds of things, the creation of a Reconstruction school here in Florida, Union Academy, which eventually became the foundation for Lincoln High School. How did the Florida Agricultural College and the East Florida Seminary functioned in a state that, after 1877, became officially dedicated to the denial of black participation in the political process, black civil rights, and so on. And basically, some of the research indicated that those two institutions were, again, heavily invested in white supremacy, both in the student body, in the way the state government allocated resources to them. I think one of the things, Adrian, you discovered was with regard to the Florida Agricultural College, that it received a major fund from Henry Flagler, whose fortune was, of course, built on the railroad industry, much of which was built on the back of black convict leasing laborers. And so the Florida Agricultural College, like the East Florida Seminary, was derived from the expropriation of essentially free, unpaid black labor. So those are the kinds of things that we discovered in our work, and again, we concluded that there was a kind of a very strong connection between white supremacy, white education, and the denial of black equality in Florida in that 40-year period, just prior to the founding of the University of Florida.
If you look at the table of contents, and I just encourage you to do, it helps me remember how we organized the work. And just to echo what my colleagues have said, we organized into subcommittees, chronology, in terms of chronological changes over time. But I also want, if you look on page Roman numeral 3, you'll see that we ended up doing a historical timeline, which I think is a really excellent supplement to the overall report. And we began before the founding of the University of Florida. We felt it was important to establish a historic context. What does it mean to be an institution founded in the Deep South, founded upon colonization, expropriation, centuries even before we were founded as an institution? There's also a source directory, too, because, again, to echo what my colleagues have been saying, we realized we had a limited amount of time, limited resources. We want people to dig into this and do what people are doing at other universities, which is to write MA theses, BA projects such as that Jon has directed, dissertations, books. We wanted this to be a helpful kind of stepping stone onto those types of projects. I also want to acknowledge that, especially early on, a lot of work for this that really should have been fully funded was done by our staff of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Tamara Jenkins, our office manager, actually took notes for all of our early meetings. And Wynn Phillips found those notes to be very, very helpful. A lot of students in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, the Department of History and African American Studies stepped up to do research for the project. So this is really a community effort. I also want to highlight the introduction. I was asked to write the introduction towards the end of the process, and reading over the report for me was revelatory. And a lot of the events that you may suspect are in the report are actually in the report. Black Thursday, some of the iconic events of our university's history, but there's a lot of surprises here. There's a lot of like, whoa, sit up straight in your seat types of things. And what I try to do to kind of conclude the report with my introduction was to give an analytical take on the history of UF. And one of the takeaways to me is that student activism at this university has gotten more important over time, and that as long as university has only taken its moral compass from state government, we have lagged severely. But when we listen to student activism, when we listen to the voices of community, retirees, alumni, we have actually made some forward progress. The other takeaway was the importance of the outside movements, especially the civil rights movement. Before the civil rights movement, you would not have wanted to attend the University of Florida if you were a person of color. Well, you couldn't have attended the University of Florida if you were a person of color. The civil rights movement really changed everything in the Deep South, and not just here, but at the University of Georgia, at UVA, which has been mentioned. So the connection between this campus, the broader Black freedom struggle, indigenous struggles was just vital. And so I was able to sneak in some movement history after all. But the movement has been very important in getting us even to the report. The Black Lives Matter movement, without that movement, we would not have this report.
Thank you guys for those insightful answers about the formation of the task force. My name is Krystin Anderson. I'm a senior anthropology major here and also one of the student researchers at SPOHP. And I have a three-part question for you. First, what surprised you most in your research of UF's history? Part two, what surprised you the least? And part three, what did you find that made you think the most of your students or the current UF campus?
Well, let me do the second question first. The thing that surprised me least would be that that race was a major issue at the University of Florida throughout its history, and continues to be so. So it surprised me most. That's a good question. But there were a lot of incidents, there were a lot of things that happened at the University of Florida. I don't know if they surprised me, but they certainly had affected me in terms of how I feel about the university and what it's done in the past. Several incidents. One that strikes me and stands out is the murder of an African American child in one of the dormitories, and that's included in our section of the report. His mother was one of the women who did laundry for students, and she was not allowed to go into the dormitory, so she sent her son into the dormitory to collect money that was owed her. And a student, he knocked on this child knocked on the door of a student. The student was upset, told the child to go away. The child went away, came back later, and at that point he shot the child and killed him. And it's just, again, this is a period of time in our history where these kind of things happened, and we know they happened, but when you read about them and you read about what happened at the University of Florida, it's different. It's more, it really hits home. What was the third question?
What did you find that made you think of your students or the current UF campus?
Oh, well, yeah, there's been a lot of, in more recent years, a lot of activism, and there still is a lot of activism going on. The event that really stands out from is the 1971 Black Thursday, the sit-down, which really propelled the university, forced the university to look inside and see, what were the problems. Why was the University of Florida not advancing in terms of desegregating and just changing the culture on campus? So, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Regarding your first two questions, I don't really think I was surprised by anything, in the sense that a lot of colleges and universities, especially if they were built in the 1800s, they're going to have some sort of connection to racial injustice. Because if you look back at the history, wealth, education, and slavery, they're all connected. Like the rich families back then, they donated to these schools. Their children attended these schools. So a lot of institutions, they have those kinds of ties to some sort of racial injustice. So I wasn't necessarily surprised to learn more about UF's financial connections to the slave trade or to convict leasing. And regarding your third question, I think I just have a new appreciation for UF with this task force. I'm a big Gator fan, double Gator. It's great to be a Florida Gator. And I think with this report, learning this history and telling this history, it's difficult. It's uncomfortable to learn about, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. And one of my favorite quotes, it comes from a UF Law alumni and former Florida Governor Reuben Askew. He said, "A leader is someone who cares enough to tell the people not merely what they want to hear, but what they need to know." And to me, this task force report is yeah, you probably don't want to hear it, but it's what you need to know. So having this as a product, it really shows me that UF is a leading institution and we're able to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think when I got on board, obviously I do civil rights, Black Power, scholarship, and research, and pretty much looking at UF is with context with other Southern universities. So it's always teaching students how compare and contrast. So what happened to UF, you see UGA, LSU, Tennessee, and other Southern universities. But obviously something unique about UF, or maybe not, so the student activism all throughout the South. So I think for me, just learning this history as directed African American Studies program helps to create the context. But at the same time, we see how much work that still needs to be done. If you look at Black student enrollment, Black faculty, same structural issues that you'll see in the independent Alligator in the 80s and the 90s, always asking these climate questions. So I think what the report does, it starts from where Dr. King started 50 years ago with his last book, Where to Go From Here, Chaos to Community, right? That we have to look at institutionalized racism, and how do we address equity, right? Racial equity. So I think this report, everyone on this stage agrees with that. This report points that out. So how to create policies and programs to address institutional inequality and not just settle for, individual success or an individual program, right? We got to get to the root of these issues. And if you look at the report, Black student enrollment, 2007, 3567, 2020, 2,127. Now, again, this is a national problem also. And we also see a lot of top Black students going to HBCUs. So we have to recognize that there's work to be done. You just can't sit back and say we're number 5 and automatically students are going to appear at the door. It's more complicated than that. And I think we have to recognize that as UF faculty, staff, and administrators, that's going to take more work than just saying you're the flagship. Because for a lot of African American students now, they see HBCUs as an alternative, in that whether they rank 15 or 12 or 8 or 9, ultimately that's not what drives a lot of students.
What surprised me most was learning that the Morrill Land Grant College Act of 1862, as it pertains to the University of Florida, involved the expropriation of land west of the Mississippi River. And so I was naive about that. I thought there was a direct relationship between the land grant, geography, and the siting of the universities that benefited from that. So you can read the details on pages 56 through 59, I think it is, in this report. But 120 tribes were affected west of the Mississippi across 9 states for the script of 90,000 plus acres. Didn't amount to a lot because UF, the way the land grant worked was that it was allocated in proportion to the non-indigenous population of the state. So Florida wasn't very large then, right after the Civil War. And so it only got 90,000, and in today's dollars, it's only a couple $1 million. But I don't think the small size of that diminishes the unjust nature of it. And it really shocked me. Now, a lot of this was ceded by treaty. Some of it was seized by unratified treaties, and in one case, the Washoe Indians of California taken by force. But it was just the scope of it is just really dramatic. And when I brought it up in the report that the university's land grant status, which is heralded, it was heralded by IFAS in a web page, made no mention of the expropriation of Native American land. It soon disappeared from the internet. So at least we have one little impact here, maybe. So that was my biggest surprise, and it really chalked up to my naivete. I should have known that, but I have to credit these guys, these investigative reporters for High Country News in 2020 did this great expose, and they have an interactive database. You can download the records, and you can see that some schools, like up in New York where there's larger populations, benefited from enormous expropriations from Native people. What didn't surprise me was that the University of Florida meets the letter of the law in its stewardship of land that it owns or manages, but does not meet the spirit of the law. I've known this because I've been keeping an eye on them for 24 years. Every time they put a backhoe into the ground, I get in touch with them and say, can I see the 106 report that was required by the federal government for land alteration? And usually they say, well, that wasn't in a high sensitivity area, or that was covered by a previous permit, or, geez, we forgot. So happily, they have a new staff member that actually reached out to us and wanted to know what we could do to remediate that. And my recommendation would be that we have a campus-wide archaeology survey program, and it's pretty much budget neutral. We would be happy to do it, and we're going to do it anyway, whether they like it or not, I think. So that's the thing that surprised me least. And then the thing about students, I'm not sure how the question was phrased, but I do want to herald the students, both of the past, that their activism precipitated action on the part of the University of Florida to do things like initiate an American Indian and Indigenous Studies program and a minor and an interdisciplinary studies program that's administered through Latin American Studies. All that was pushed by student activism. And I got to say, on this committee, if it weren't for the student members of this committee, I'm not sure that us old guys would have been finished by now. They really carried a lot of the weight and pushed it with their high energy. So I think that's a huge tribute to how change, can come from places of maybe we don't recognize it as power, lack of power, but there's an enormous power there that when it's mustered can move mountains, right? So thanks, guys.
So the complicated question, I have to admit that I find these details to all be surprising, and I think that I'm still learning, and I don't like to become desensitized, and so I find it shocking. And so that said, I was also surprised, and this brings me to current students because I wear a lot of hats. I'm at UF, I'm faculty, staff, and a student, so I was trying to wear my student hat a lot in this, and I was emotionally challenged by this. It was painful stuff. It was upsetting. It was angrying. Angrying, is that a word?
It is now.
Yes. I also made up desegregator during this, and that was a big deal, so that's a term I invented. But that said, considering our current students, it made me realize that there isn't really always neutral research and objectivity. That, you could, being a person whose family came from like Mississippi and the South and was part of the Great Migration and all of that, like segregation, slavery, redlining, all of that is very personal and affecting. And so, like, this ask of being objective about it is sort of weird and difficult, right? And so that's why my section, I think, has so many references in it. So I don't know why, but the other thing I wanted to say is, like, being a geneticist as part of my trade, I came into this with a keen interest in eugenics, and so I already had read a lot about the movement, had a lot of memorized names, had graphs, had charts, had lists and things, and so one thing that maybe was surprising was when I went into the U.S. archives and looked at people's dissertations and looked at their reference lists and looked at the textbooks that were being used, my eye immediately saw all of these major players in the eugenics movement as references, as experts in people's research on education, all of this, right? And so thinking about students merging their different interests together, but also coming in with a lot of preparation when they hit a new task. So those are like the experience of a student I was definitely having during this. And so I thought about being a student a lot, and particularly like choosing a challenging and personal topic to research. Like, why are you interested in something, right? Why are you interested in, like, why was I ever interested in genetics? Or why was I ever it's usually something personal, And so it's really hard to be objective when you do that kind of research.
Rather than think about what surprised me or didn't surprise me, I'd like to sort of reframe it and answer by way of like, how did this research make me think about things, my historical understanding of UF, of other things, and I came to think of it as a narrative that involved kind of like two strands of DNA of the University of Florida and its entwined and entangled history with Black Gainesville at the time of the Civil War, and into basically up through the end of the 19th century. Gainesville was a Black majority town. In 1865, 62% of Alachua County was African American, and same thing here in Gainesville, which is a pretty small town at that time. And then here's this white institution comprised of the children of the student body of the elite, the planting elite in town in Alachua County, and sort of the entangled histories that that the institution of the University of Florida and the town in which it's embedded came to represent, and extending into the 20th century still represented, kind of an entwinement, like a double helix kind of thing. My genetic analogy may not be, up to snuff, but still represented both entanglement and separation, deep separation that obviously the UF is still working to get beyond, and try to bridge those gaps. And so that's very much a work in progress. And I think one of the things that we hoped was that our report would help to fashion a kind of historical consciousness that would make that process easier. In regards to students, I would say that I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, which has a deep involvement in its history. Thomas Jefferson founded it, of course, and for years and years, when I was in school there, no one talked about slavery. It was not, mentioned. University denied much involvement with it. As far as Thomas Jefferson's own involvement with slaveholding, well, everybody did it. That shouldn't really count against him that much. That narrative, of course, has shifted in recent decades. And as institutions like Brown University, Harvard, Columbia, Yale, and others began to confront their histories of involvement with slavery, UVA they reached a point where they couldn't avoid it anymore. And so they kind of dove headlong into it and are now one of the leaders of that self-study, that institutional research, and they've found that University of Virginia was founded upon and based upon the enslavement and labor of at least 5,000 documented individuals. Okay, so that's a pretty astonishing find, and they are sort of embracing it now and saying, okay, well, we can't hide from the truth, as Adrian suggested earlier. We can't hide from it. We have to embrace it. UF is not quite there just yet, okay, but we're getting there, and I think this report signifies a significant advance in that. And I think, as has been pointed out multiple times, students are behind it. They are fully invested in it. They are engaged with it. They're helping to drive the research and the inquiry further. And so it's up to the next generation of student activists to keep that momentum going, building upon efforts here, but also in this report, and the efforts of students to get us to this point so far.
This narrative is really an odyssey from 1853 to present and beyond. It's an extraordinary story. UF was not created for people like us. It wasn't created for women. It wasn't created for Catholics. It wasn't created for Jewish people. It certainly wasn't created for African Americans, Latinos, first-generation immigrants. And yet here we are today. Adrian talks about loving the University of Florida. I love the University of Florida. I love my students. But 30, 50 years from now, I wouldn't have been welcome here. And so how did that process begin? Who initiated it? Who was responsible? To echo what my colleague Ken said a few minutes ago, to me the most surprising thing is how people stayed in and fought to make this a better place, to make it a place that we could all love and be a part of and be welcoming. And those terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to me are more important than ever, because 50 years ago, UF was not, it had nothing to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, right? The students, the faculty, the staff, the community had to struggle. The part, I'm looking at page 79 of the report, and the heroic role of the very small number of Native Americans here who created the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program in 2008. To me, that was surprising. I didn't know that program had been created in 2008. I should have known, though. It was student activism that really was responsible for creating African American studies. It was student activism that drove gender and women's studies. It was student activism that just last year pushed the Department of History to rename our conference room in honor of a young professor who was driven out of this university because he dared to critique secession, and he dared to challenge the idea that Florida should have seceded from the Union. And they drove him out of here. A citizens committee from Gainesville came to this campus and told the president of the university, you get rid of him or we'll take care of it, right? So to say we've come a long way is a dramatic understatement. And this report, to me, is a very important document that shows how we reached this point where people like you and I can say, hey, I love this place. Has a lot of flaws, got a long way to go, that is for sure. But my gosh, how far we've come. But it all came about through struggle. To me, that's the main takeaway. And it's a vindication of our students today who come here, the students we have who say, yeah, I want to get my degree, I want to succeed, I want to pay the bills, put food on the table, I want to go to law school, med school, but I want to make this place a better place for everyone. That part of our student body, to me, is vindicated by this report, because that part of our student body that goes here to do more than just individual uplift always feels outnumbered, right? Always feels stressed out. What am I doing enough? Am I volunteering enough? Am I getting involved in enough activities? But this report says, yeah, it is enough. What you're doing, keep doing it, right? Just keep doing it.
Wow, thank you guys. This is going to be our last question before open Q&A from the audience. And I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Donovan Carter. I'm a second-year master's student here. And this last question is, it has a couple parts. So firstly, how did you deal with backlash from the university and other entities during this process, maybe the community or anyone like that? And also, how are these findings meaningful both inside and outside of UF and beyond our Gainesville community?
Well, it's been mentioned before, but we realized that we had limitations on what we could do and what we couldn't do, but we tried to exceed those limitations as much as we could. We're in a period of time now where it's very difficult in the state of Florida, particularly at a public institution, to speak freely and deal with the issues that we would like to deal with, and that was apparent very early on. I would like to see this our work be carried on. In addition to, as other people have said, it's just at the beginning, and there's more research that can be done. I'd also like to see the report be included in a lot of our curriculum. It should be. Every student that comes to the University of Florida should know something about our past, and particularly our past in relationship to race. The last question again was what? Sorry. I got distracted myself.
That's okay. The second part of the question is, how are these findings meaningful both inside and outside of UF and beyond the Gainesville community?
Yeah, and that maybe one of the shortcomings of this report is that it really doesn't deal with the community at large and our relationship to the community to the extent that it should. It seems it's very internal. It's about the University of Florida, and I think at some point we may have forgotten that we were part of a larger community, and I think that's something that needs to be dealt with.
So one thing that I was told when I first got onto this task force, I had a meeting with Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, a wonderful person, and I remember telling her, like, our student government resolution passed, and, like, I was appointed to this task force, and she was so supportive of all of it. But one thing she told me, she was like, Adrianne, you need to make sure that this isn't just a performative measure. Like, you need to make sure that, like, this isn't something that the university just does and then it sits on the shelf for, like, the next task force to look at. So I went in with, like, a head of, like, we need to make sure that whatever happens here, like, it's meaningful change. It's not just going to be a performative task that the university does. So with our report, I'm very, very proud to say that, like, we made this, and even, like, for us to be having this panel right now, like, it means so much that to have this kind of interest of, like, the UF community and the greater Gainesville community into it, because this is essentially, it's a living document, and we're going to keep adding to it and adding to it. So that's one of the things I think is really meaningful in that sense. And moving forward from this report, one thing that me and my colleagues here are really pushing for is for UF to join something called the University Studying Slavery Consortium. It is a multi-collaborative consortium made up of around 100 universities and colleges around the nation, and actually 6 countries, including Harvard, Georgetown, Yale, Clemson, all really great leading institutions. And we're hoping that, you know, with the publication of this report, that our new president will officially sign on to that consortium, because what we've done here, it's very meaningful with Florida, because there's no Florida institution in USS yet. So we're hoping to have UF be that first Florida institution. I was very fortunate to travel to the University of Virginia with Dr. Sensbach in September, and we went to the University Studying Slavery conference at the University of Virginia. We were able to present our task force report there. Even though, like, UF hasn't officially signed on to it, we were still able to go and represent UF. And one thing that I learned there was there are people that are members of USS, but they're very, like, they're performative. So one of the best compliments we got after our panel was, like, you guys are the opposite. Like, you guys are doing this meaningful work, and you just have yet to actually sign on to it. So I'm really proud of the work that me and my colleagues have created. I'm proud of UF for assembling this task force, and I know that, like, whatever happens, like, the future generations are going to add on to it. So I'm very hopeful with it all.
There wasn't much blowback, but we just had discussions about the nature of history. And I know we know as historians, histories change over time, but I came up with a definition. History is what you want to hear and don't want to hear at the same time. All right, so of course we want to hear how UF has made all this progress, but you don't want to hear there's still work to be done, right? When we talk about history, what you want to hear, that's subjective. What you don't want to hear is political, right? But the bottom line is the report was designed to do, that's what historians do, right? Now, we weren't allowed to make policy suggestions, but obviously in the report, you're going to hear what you want to hear, right? The progress has been made, and hear what you need to hear is what still needs to be done. So I think we went in with that approach. We had some great conversations about it, and just showed you how, history is very nuanced, it's complicated, but just remember what I said. You can quote me, right? It's what you want to hear and you don't want to hear at the same time, right? So we want to hear about the great thing about any political leader you can think of, what their greatest attributes are, but you don't want to hear what challenges they have. But that's not history, right? History is that showing two things at the same time, which allows us as scholars, as readers of this report, to try to make it better. But even when you make it better, it's still work. There's always work to be done. So I think that's what we went in with this report. And, like I said, there was no blowback, and people get nervous, but I think it says it for itself with the resources that we cited. We got the data, we got the numbers, and like we said before, it's a foundation for future studies.
In my aspect, the Native American history wasn't terribly controversial, and in fact, from the get-go, I thought it was almost an afterthought for this project until I learned from my colleagues here how these histories are intertwined through slavery. But it can be controversial, and it probably will in the future because of UF's obligations to Native American tribes through federal, mostly federal legislation, but also state law as well. So. Simultaneously with the production of this, my department, me and a couple others in particular, have been assembling the resources necessary to create a new degree program in our department. And it's public archaeology or public anthropology, and a lot of it's driven by the market. We just don't see an expanding PhD market, but we do see growth for terminal MAs in middle management, for cultural resource management and whatnot. But ours is going to have a distinctive bent to it, which we don't see at other universities in the Southeast, which is a certificate in indigenous archaeology. And so I spent a lot of the summer working with the Seminole tribe, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, to get their input on what a curriculum would look like to serve their needs. And it's a curriculum that'll be unfamiliar to UF departments and professors. It may be one that requires in the future that we aggressively seek out indigenous scholars to resource this new certificate, which may mean changing the criteria by which we judge people's performance and production. I don't think the old model is going to work terribly well. So I think I can answer this question better in about 5 years when we see how all this goes. But I'm excited about the prospects and really happy that we developed a healthy relationship with the Seminole tribe. There's other aspects here that are ongoing, like dealing with Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It's very healthy that the Florida Museum of Natural History was able to convince the provost office to hire a full-time NAGPR coordinator for the first time. The law was passed in 1990, and UF has been heeding the need and attending to requests as they come along, but now they're taking a more proactive approach to it. So I think good things are coming in that respect. And the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program is growing. We've added more affiliates. Anyone interested, there's no strings attached. Just let me know, and we'll be happy to add you as an affiliate and join us in our programming and hopefully developing new curriculum and degree programs in the future.
I'm going to ask for a question repeat. Is that okay? So I was listening so hard, and then I couldn't remember what the question was.
No, that's quite all right. So I guess the first part of it is, how did you deal with the backlash from the university or anyone in the community, right? And how are your findings meaningful both inside and outside of UF and beyond Gainesville?
So the backlash question I just appreciate. I think that during the making of the report and during the research process, there was a struggle. There was some struggle that was going on with what was our purpose, what were we selected for, why were we here, who picked us, all of those kind of things. There were questions, so there was struggle within. As far as like, boom, this thing hitting and then something happening, I haven't experienced anything actually. The only thing I think that feels like a soft backlash was that we were tasked to write this by the president of the university, and I guess I would maybe have liked to hear him discuss it, or I don't know. So it's not like a backlash, like a punishment, but it's sort of like a softer thing. And then the other question, like the larger context, I'm overwhelmed by that question. I really don't know. I'd like to think that this is important and that it'll matter and that it'll make an impact. And I myself personally know that how I'm going to use it in my scholarship, and so there's that. But I wanted to kind of add to that, it's like a learning process. It's like different working within the system versus working outside of it. And so I can't tell you how much I've learned just from being in a group like this of folks that do history, work with administrators, really try to get things done, and don't like get upset like I always do, and so it's been amazing. I just really appreciate the work that's gone into this in my own personal development during this time, and I'm anxious to see what kind of splash this will make.
Well, we live in a time of increased reckoning with historical legacies of slavery, racism, oppressions of all kinds. We see apologies being issued by institutions. We see statues being tumbled, Confederate statues being removed. We find all kinds of reckonings or half-reckonings with the legacies of these histories. What this report can mean or should mean in that regard is very much a work in progress. It's a question that has not been answered, and so we all have to think about what those possible answers can be, what kind of reparative or restorative justice, if any, can come from having done some of the basic research and laid an empirical basis in knowledge from which we can act. But as Carl mentioned in his remarks, I mean, these questions are being asked at a very difficult time in our state's history. As we know, the governor has asked deans and colleges to present information and documentation for all resources being dedicated to DEI instruction or staffing, critical race theory. Okay, anything that's devoted to critical race theory, DEI, all those resources have to be reported to the state. The implications are rather ominous as to what that might mean in terms of potential withdrawal of resources, and so to come forward with a task force report like this that suggests that more resources should be devoted to those causes rather than fewer, that more institutional knowledge and awareness needs to be devoted and dedicated to the troubling questions raised in a report like this. The possibility that those questions could run headlong into state legal intervention at this point are very troubling. So there's a lot yet to be answered in that regard. So we'll have to see how it happens. But we feel like we've opened some questions that need hard thinking about and hard addressing in order to be able to answer.
Okay, so my staff has just handed me some notes here, and I think we're going to transition over into the Q&A, audience Q&A portion. We do have a Zoom audience with us, and so let me ask the shorter question first and make sure I have it. So one of the questions is, okay, Oh, yeah, and we'll have a mic that can circulate to the audience here as well. Can you share some names of some of the tribes and their migrations post-1853?
Tribes in Florida?
I would think maybe tribes in Florida.
Post-1850?
Post-1853.
Well, Seminole. Miccosukee, Seminole, Miccosukee.
And Yuchi.
By after 1853, John?
I don't know.
I think that would be.
Yeah. I mean, the Timucua, North Florida, the history at Spanish Contact was Timucua tribes. There's quite a few members of that language group that were distributed across the north of Florida from the East Coast to the Gulf. And they are, for all intents and purposes, no longer represented in communities that are recognized, certainly not recognized by the government as a sovereign nation. No doubt they have descendants that survive culturally, if not also biologically, through traditions passed down through the interaction of tribes across vast territories. As an archaeologist, one of the things that I've learned in 40 years of doing archaeology, there are no boundaries. There's linguistic boundaries, but there are no boundaries of interaction. Constant interaction, constant movement, sharing, distributing, negotiating, acknowledging common purposes in places. And so whenever I'm doing archaeology and somebody says, who are these people that you're working on? Who are these ancestors? I say, I can't really tell you that. They're probably a little bit of everybody. And so it's a fair question, but I think after 1853, we're talking primarily about Seminole and Miccosukee that are the two federally recognized tribes in Florida. John, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't. No.
So the next question via Zoom, and then we'll start taking live audience. Well, the people on Zoom are live also. That's probably a misnomer. I thought the task force was to focus more on minority students, and the report barely mentions students in a chapter. Any follow-up on that? I'm going to walk down to Professor Canton because he was on the student activism or the 60s, but also to mention for a long part of the history of this university, we didn't have minority students. And so this is something I want to turn over to Professor Canton.
Right, that's a great question. I think it goes to what we're saying, that this report's not an end-all, be-all. So again, when I arrived at UF, Black Thursday, the book that Paul and Dr. Gordon worked on mentioned some students that during the 1960s, early 70s. But we do know student activism was here at UF. Now, for those who want to take the next step and do archival research and maybe do biographies on a group of students, they're definitely welcome to do it. But overall, this is just an overview that students in the late 60s, Black Thursday organized, similarly to across the country, to push universities to hire more Black faculty and staff. There are tons of nameless people, more than likely, right? There's name figures, tons of nameless other figures that can do further research. But overall, this report, is an overview of African history at UF, not a final history, but just, again, a foundation. I think that's what one have to keep in mind when they read this report. But definitely keep in mind that Black students like UF, UGA, University of Virginia, organized, formed Black student unions to push universities to desegregate and to provide spaces for African American students, faculty, and staff.
Also, the report does touch on a lot of research that was done by students, like the whole section on eugenics are graduate theses that were written by students. So I'm not sure, and the ask was to study the relationship of the University of Florida with African American and Native American histories. So it was a very express ask in the name of the report.
Yes. So we're going to take one right over here, and then we'll come to that side.
Thank you. Your material implies that one of several reasons for the move of Florida Seminary from Ocala to Gainesville was a sort of yanking out the rug from freedmen who were kind of sitting in on the Ocala campus, making demands, maybe with implied backup of federal troops. So that's question one, but it's just an example of many buried facts that I'd wish to have taught to local grade school students, and instead of reserving it for those who get to college and it comes as kind of a dissonant shock and awe experience because they haven't had it in the early instruction. They should be getting it back as early as third grade. So how can this task force catalyze broader teaching of history in the public system that has suffered profound stumbles in trying to roll out African American history recently?
Who's that question to? Who's it to?
Anybody.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part about the seminary in Ocala?
Oh, yeah, the first narrow idea question. Your material implies that one of several reasons for the move of Florida Seminary from Ocala to Gainesville was kind of yanking out the rug because of freedmen sitting in on the Ocala campus and making demands, and maybe with implied backup of federal forces.
Yeah, that could be. That was sort of the immediate aftermath at the end of the Civil War and the announcement of freedom to the enslaved population and the celebration of emancipation. Shortly thereafter, there was a lot of political wheeling and dealing, bids and counter bids between Gainesville and Ocala as to the relocation of the seminary, and so Gainesville won out and Ocala lost. Whether that was directly connected to the event that you referred to, I'm not sure, but it could very well have been. Somebody else may want to take on this second question. Yeah. Okay.
So I think your question is amazing, and it really goes to like the shock you feel when you discover things when you could have been taught them all along. And so, Kali, I appreciate your question about pre-college access to information, right? And that takes skill and access, and I agree. I think that would be a really strong use of this work is to collaborate with the community and with schools and figure out how to incorporate this into history in the pre-collegiate spaces as well. So.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, this maybe is for Paul or for anyone. When y'all were tasked with doing this report, what did the university administration say they hoped or expected to come out of this, and how have they responded since you completed your work on the task force?
Sure.
Thanks for just throwing my career away. But no, seriously, so when I was writing the introduction, I had colleagues and dear friends and some in Tigard Hall who asked about, the drift of the report, Paul, are you sure, that event, it's kind of shocking. Are you sure that should be in the report? I wouldn't even call that blowback. I would just call that people concerned, because you have to remember, halfway through the 2 years we were working on this report, the first anti-woke law was passed targeting K through 12 teachers. And that law wasn't just attacking critical race theory, it was attacking the 1619 history curriculum, and it was attacking any discussion of systemic racism. And so, yeah, all of that had an effect, and I think that our administration, how many of you know that our university has an anti-racist website thing? How many of you know that? Okay, so that's a response to your question in part. It's there, but very few people know. We actually have an anti-racist website, and 90+% of the content of that website was generated by the students and staff of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, because we have enjoyed, and this goes back to an earlier question, we've just had to live with the fact that our administration, and not just here, is concerned with what's happening in state government. And Jon mentioned earlier the demand to make an account of all of your DEI courses, programs, institutions. I mean, my whole career rests upon DEI. So I guess I'm sorry about that, Jon. I mean, you're my chair, so I mean, I guess.
Yeah, it's been nice knowing you.
Exactly. So yeah, we faced those pressures, but I think how we dealt with them was, on the one hand, not to really care what Tigert Hall thought. I mean, they set the process in motion. Hazel mentioned it would have been nice to get some feedback from Dr. Fox, but after a while, that didn't really matter because we had so much momentum. The students, pushing us, the great research, digging deep. Dr. Levy finding this there's incredible nuggets here. I mean, the curriculum of this university, eugenics, think about it. Ken Burns just, I don't know how many of you have seen that wonderful series, The U.S. and the Holocaust. So this study places University of Florida squarely within that tradition of eugenics, which if you don't know it, you don't know how to fight inequality in the society. I'm sorry. So I think we just stopped caring at a certain point. I think maybe early on there was concern, but because we lean on each other, I'm looking in the front row, I'm going to call out Dean Judy Russell at the libraries, who's always had our back, her staff, Jim Cusick, Carl Van Ness, Flo Turcott, sorry to call you out. You can't have good research without good librarians. We have the best in the country. And whenever we need to do research on issues involving women's equality, African American history, Latino history, the libraries are there for us. Whenever SPOHP has needed support, if you look at the challenging racism, the timeline, the People's History timeline, you know who funded that? That radical provost Joe Glover. Yeah, seriously. Provost Joe Glover has provided the funding for the creation of the Joelle Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History that Dean Russell's unit has made into a reality. So I think leaning on each other, that's been the key. Is it scary sometimes? Sure. But because we support each other, we can get it done. I rambled a lot. Sorry about that.
All right, so this will be our last question in this room so that we can get over to the reception at the Institute of Black Culture, which is right across the street on University Avenue, that we'd like to invite all of you to join us for. So our last question.
Thank you for taking my question. I looked at the timeline here, and I was surprised, indeed dismayed. No mention of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Did it happen here? Was there any connection between it and the civil rights movement? I think there should have been, because the draft was very unfair to people socioeconomically and racially, discrimination. So that's my question.
It's an oversight, and we actually talked about that as we were kind of wrapping things up. And again, I think getting back to something that Dave Canton said, realizing we just couldn't do a comprehensive narrative. But that's a part of the history of this university that is well covered in our university archives. Carl Van Ness, by the way, our former university historian, want to give him a shout out, and also in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program archives. We have literally scores of narratives where people talk about student activism on this campus, the intersection of the Black student movement with the Third World student movement, with the anti-war movement. But yeah, one of our regrets of not getting that in the report should have been there. But there's a lot of other things, I think. Again, I think, echoing my colleagues, we can use the report as a foundation, realizing that there's silences, there's elisions, but there is great material out there that we can use to catch up to those important histories.
It's going to take a while for mine to get done. Yeah, there's definitely a connection between the events of Black Thursday in 1971 and with the anti-war movement. If you look at the photographs that we have for the Black Thursday, it's sad in a way because we don't have any photographs of the actual black students who sat down in President O'Connell's office. What we have, though, are hundreds of photographs of what occurred afterwards. And what you have are hundreds of white students, maybe thousands of white students, pouring into Tigard Hall in support of the black activists. And that was just very much a part of the times. So your point is well taken there. There is a connection there between Vietnam, what was going on with the Vietnam War, just student activism in general, and what was going on with the civil rights movement and black activism as well.
I don't think anyone younger than born after 1954 understands what it was like to be at the university and realize that if you took out a course or somehow don't show up to classes, you could be in the army very quickly. Perhaps something like
I'm so this year my culture is called us, the reception is ready. Let's continue the questions, the dialogue, the discussions. Does anyone want to kind of walk us across the street and wave?
Yes, yes. So we will mostly, but yes, thank you. Thank you to each and every one of our panelists. Please join us at the Institute of Black Culture. Just a wave of us will be walking over there, but you can also put it in Google, Apple Maps, and it's right across University Avenue. So please join us over there and we can continue.